There have been various peaks and various dips in the open source realm. How many tools have been coming in, the vendors that are no longer working on open source, the vendors that are taking in open source, the huge vendors that are contributing to open source. However, we're also seeing now, some of this open source getting gobbled up, and maybe some projects not lasting as long as they were expecting to. So is open source going to continue? Is this going to be a thing that ever goes away, or will it always have the ups and the downs like, everything else? My name is Michael Levan,
And my name is Kristina and
and today we are going to talk about that exact idea. What's kind of the future, so to speak, of open source, or at least for the foreseeable future, because again, there's always these peaks that we've always seen. So that's and it's an interesting topic, right? Because
Yeah.
people are really on this side or they're really on this side. There's nothing in
Nothing
between.
in between. Yeah. Yeah, I think like especially recently with everything that has been happening, like in general in the enterprise world, that is affected by the overall country economy, global economy, all the geopolitical situations. At some point, it started affecting all the companies and the tech industry itself, which we thought for a long time didn't have challenges and had actually a lack of talent, lack of engineers, and a lot of open positions. And now we see that this has changed and became challenging for many companies. And now we see all this companies being acquired or companies going bankrupt. And then if some of those companies were actively contributing or actively maintaining a specific open source project or have been with created the project from the start and have been maintaining it for a while, and then something happened with the company, then quite a unfortunate situations happen to those open source projects, which also, I guess, increases the overall worry lately about like, okay, how can we make open source space more secure, I guess, in a way, or more predictable.
Right. Yeah, we kind of see these ups and downs, and I think it's kind of always been like that, but we saw a really big peak a couple of years ago, and then now we're kind of seeing it downturn in a sense. So if we go back to, the Steve Ballmer at Microsoft days when he was a CEO, it's public knowledge that he was pretty much like, Linux is the worst, and open source is bad, and blah blah blah, yada yada. And there was a time not too long ago where majority of organizations, I should say, not all, but the majority, wouldn't look at an open source tool. Like they were like, there's no support, there's no patching schedules, everything's kind of up in the air, it's not maintained by a particular vendor, therefore we can't use it. Even from a compliance perspective, I mean, even now, still, in some heavily compliant organizations, it's hard to utilize open source tools because of compliance. So again, there was a time where a lot of organizations wouldn't even look at an open source tool. Then, Kubernetes comes around and it becomes this huge thing. And I would argue that the top 2 or 3 biggest open source projects ever, Linux, Unix, Kubernetes, and if you consider it, Red Hat, right? Red Hat was the one that was able to take an open source project and gain financial income from it, right? Which has always been difficult to do with open source. So 2.5 or 3, depending on if you add Red Hat into the mix. But in 2015, 2016, CNCF was created 2016, maybe something like that. I forget.
No, I'm wondering if it was before that.
Was it
It's
before that?
2015.
2015.
2015.
Okay. So 2015, and Kubernetes was the big kickoff, right? So when we looked at the landscape then, There weren't a lot of tools part of the landscape. A couple of years later, there still weren't. But 2018, 2019 hit, and VCs were just throwing money at open source. I mean, there was a time where it was like your pitch deck could be bare minimum, and you would still get at least a seed rounds, right? Or a series A if it was a really good idea. So open source just kind of skyrocketed, right? And then before you knew it, again, not too long ago, less than 10 years ago, which is not a long time, more like 5, 5 years ago, the CNCF landscape just shot up, right? And we had all these tools and all this stuff. And then what happened? There was too much, caused confusion. Nobody knew what vendors to go with, right? Vendors couldn't get their products out there because there was just too much of it, right? So then we had this peak of open source where most organizations were bringing in open source. And not only that, they were contributing. Microsoft, Red Hat, huge contributors to Kubernetes, right? But now where I think, this is just my prediction, right? Everybody, please don't get mad at me. Hopefully I can still have an opinion. We're now seeing this downturn of open source. Open source projects are not getting the funding that they were before. VCs are not throwing the money that they were before. And not only that, they're getting gobbled up by these organizations, right? Cisco and Cilium, IBM and HashiCorp. Another big one also happened semi-recently that I'm probably forgetting. I forget. I don't know. So many acquisitions lately.
Yeah, that's true.
But I wonder if we're now seeing this turn of getting back to enterprise being a leader in organizations versus open source. I know I just talked a lot, but I had to get that off my chest. So I'll leave the floor to you now.
Oh no worries. I think that's very very good reflections that you have, and that's not an easy topic in a way, because there are so many factors that like affect the health of an open source project, you could say. And I think that what the reflections or the predictions that you are sharing are also valid, because that could be a bigger challenge now, because we see organizations that have been adopting different open source projects are also becoming more concerned when, I mean, that is a natural response when you see one open source project being archived or the other open source project having mainly maintainers from one company that was acquired, and then the team or most of the team has been laid off, and that team was basically behind a specific open source project. Like how can you have that good level of security or trustworthiness to that open source project, and that it will be continuously developed? And okay, if it will not be developed or getting new features, that at least the security vulnerabilities will be patched. Even that can be a good reason for worries for many enterprises that have adopted a specific open source project. So I think, like, due to all these things happening, it, of course, is a valid worry. What will happen going forward in terms of adopting open source projects? But that's where I thought like that the Linux Foundation and CNCF would be kind of like organizations that should help at least a bunch of such open source projects that are kind of being adopted more widely, as these organizations could help govern those projects so that we can, as a community, ensure that these projects are still being maintained and are still being developed, and therefore kind of lessen that worry of the organizations that have already integrated that project. So I'm wondering what you think about that, if that could still help going forward to prevent like a huge decrease in trust for open source, you could say.
So I've contributed to projects that are in the CNCF landscape, right? Being on the Kubernetes release teams and working with platform engineering teams and the AI stuff and all of that. So I do a lot of contributions, but I've never brought a tool or a software or a product that I've built and put it into the CNCF. From what I understand, you are still on your own, right? So like you're putting your tool in the CNCF landscape, but I could be wrong here. Apologies if I am. Um, but I don't think they help with like marketing your stuff or getting you funding or anything like that, right? Like it's
Mm,
again, from my understanding, it's more of like a cool kids club. You know what I mean? Like you want your icon on that landscape or whatever. So I still think that these vendors and these tools and then these pieces of software that are being written are kind of on their own in a sense. Um, and there are two primary ways to to ensure that your open source product project continues. Unfortunately, both of those ways everybody really hates. So I'll give you an example. KubeCon North America 2023. Uh, I was sitting on my laptop, right outside of like the primary floor where all the booths are and stuff. I was just sitting there doing whatever I was doing, and there was like a couch, chair. They like set it up in like four kind of whatever. So I'm sitting on the couch, and there's somebody sitting on the chair next to me. This person's friend, I have no idea who these people are, by the way. This person's friend comes up talking, and he's like, "Oh, how was the keynote?" Or how was one of the whatever? And the other guy was like, "Oh, it was this company, and they said it was sponsored, so I walked out."
mm,
Okay, so that's the world of engineering that we live in. Anything sponsored, anything blah blah blah, nobody wants to hear it. Now, the irony of that, and this is again why I always push engineers to like understand the business piece of things. These open source projects need money, right? They need funding. They need a way to keep going. Mortgages and rent and groceries still need to be paid for. Therefore, you have to do something like have marketing for your product. You have to do something like pay people to talk about it. You have to do something like getting your name out there in some type of way, or having your product still open source, but maybe charging for support or something, right? Or you sell to a company, right? To keep your project going, to keep your project funding, whether you sell to Cisco or Microsoft or Google or IBM or whoever, you got to sell to somebody to keep your stuff going because you need to make money. But in today's world, engineers don't want to hear that. They just want to hear about the engineering, but that's not reality, right? The reality is that a project needs funding to continue. So to your point, I think it's going to continue to be rocky. I think for a bit. What are your kind of thoughts on that? I mean,
mm.
do you agree? Do you disagree? Because I'm always curious to hear everybody's thoughts because I tend to put things like when in those types of conversations, I for whatever reason my brain automatically goes to like the business acumen of things, you know,
Yeah,
because
but that's
it's
good. In a way, you need to have that because
right,
engineering is also business. It's
right,
tied up in business.
100%,
So,
100%.
but like I think it will be rocky due to all the trends that we have been seeing, just like you recently, like just now, share the details about. But in a way, I don't think personally that it will, um, go like die or like disappear. I
Mhm.
think I see also a different trend that kind of increases collaboration inside the community and in a way also strengthens part of the community to kind of support those open source projects that are, for example, widely adopted and have been struggling. We've seen what happened with Terraform and the creation of Open Tofu, right? An example of how community didn't like the licensing changes and still wanted to have something that is truly open source and try to get a better governance for that, which was kind of ended up in being the Open Tofu that is now under the Linux Foundation. I think they also applied for the CNCF, being a part of the CNCF project. And just coming to what you mentioned, that you weren't sure about, like if CNCF provides anything for the projects. It does, like in
Okay.
terms of it doesn't provide funding necessarily, but you, first of all, to enter like the ecosystem, you need to be an incubating project, you still need to have a bunch of factors so that CNCF can kind of accept that proposal. And having some active maintainers and like a healthy project development lifecycle is one thing. But then once you enter, you also need to keep that going. So they kind of still have this, I think it's yearly, if I'm not mistaken, they have this evaluation of the projects that are done inside CNCF to ensure that the project still is being actively developed and is healthy. And at least for like the incubating and graduated projects, not sandboxed ones, but the incubating and graduated, I think they're always called. Um, they offer like the marketing services, all the places at the events, different tutorials, workshops, technical writing. So they like help at least to spread awareness about the project, and maybe this can also attract some of the funding as well. So they can kind of help with that, and then they can help with like hosting some of the services, like for getting the CI/CD stuff in place for the project, or other tools you may need that may cost money. So they could help like with these things. But of course, they, as a non-profit organization, in a way, they don't come in with a bunch of money for your project. So that's why I feel like it still has some. It can offer something to ensure that they do their best to like at least ensure that your project can stay afloat. But of course, this is not always as easy, especially
Right.
if there is like one organization that has been maintaining the project. If changes happen there, it's not given that the maintainers of that project that have been laid off, for example, would do that on their free time or would get the same possibility in another job. So this challenge, I guess, will always be there.
Right.
So like personally, I believe that having organizations like CNCF and the Linux Foundation that are at least trying to do something to govern some of the larger open source projects, and keep them healthy is better than having nothing. And I think for those projects, I believe there will be there will be more stability than for the projects being outside of such governing organizations. But I still don't think that it will die out, because I think the community feeling about open source and the importance of it is still strong, and I feel like it became stronger to some extent after these changes happening. But then it comes to like, how do we ensure that open source developers actually can use time for developing those projects if they're not getting paid for it, for example? And I'm a bit concerned if, due to the tight economy, many companies would suddenly decrease the amount of time you could use on an open source project, which you used to do as part of your full-time job. And that, I think, can affect a lot some of these projects, unless the overall business and economic situation would change.
Yeah, that that's obviously a huge piece, 100%. Yeah, and I agree with you. I don't think that it's going to go away. I do wonder what kind of the future looks like. And the other thing too is I think we all got to kind of keep an open mind. Like, for example, we all know why HashiCorp changed their license now, right?
Yeah.
But now the question is, I mean, I always tell, if I ever talk to a vendor or whatever, I always tell them the same thing. If you start open source, fine. If you start paid, not open source, fine. Or maybe you have a free version, but it's not open source, fine. But never go from open source to paid. You cannot
Mm,
make that transition, right? If you start out as paid, right? Or you start out as not open source and you have a paid version, but you also have a free version, cool. Nobody cares about that all that much and nobody's going to freak out. But if you change your license model like that, or you go from open source to not, you're going to get a lot of pushback, right?
mm.
So that's engineering Mike talking. Business Mike, on the other hand, asks a question, which is, would you prefer the project die, or would you prefer it get bought so you can still use it? And that's a big question, right? Because you got to remember, despite how large some of these projects are and how many employees they have and how much funding they have, there aren't too many that are profitable, believe it or not. Like a lot of these big projects that have a lot of funding, and the reason why they keep getting funding is because they're not all that profitable, which is expected. It's expected for these projects to not be profitable. VCs are, so the thing about VCs are, let's say they throw money at 10 companies, they know 9 of them are going to fail. They're just banking on that one, right? Um, so that's kind of the gist. The gist is that they know they're not going to make money, which is fine. But there also comes a point where it's like, okay, time to make some money now. We need some return on our investment, whether that is making the product become profitable or selling, right? So everybody can get their payday. Now that's the business side of things. The other side of it is, again, would you prefer the project go away, or do you prefer to be able to continue to use the project, um, but it have some licensing differences and that, this and that, and blah blah blah. Now, again, because there's about 10 to 15 different personalities in my head. The other personality says, yeah, no, I get it, right? Like I don't want the license changes because that's messed up. Like you should never go from one to another. But then again, the other side of it is like, would you prefer to go away? And I don't know what the right answer is. The answer is subjective 100%. There cannot be a right or wrong answer. Um, but
Yeah.
it's a lot to think about and digest and really begin to understand.
Yeah, definitely. And if you like think about the end user, right? The companies that have got used to use all these free open source projects, how many of those companies actually think about supporting that project financially, right? You're just
Mhm.
used to that. It's always free, always being developed, updated, patched, you name it. So maybe that is also like one of the main challenges right now. That is the reason for why we are seeing so many projects struggle. Like if you would look at a different business model, let's say you every open source project would have, if you are an enterprise adopting that, and then you would support it a little bit,
Mm.
then we're talking about like the price. If it's a little bit, if every company in every enterprise integrating that project would pay a little bit, then that return on investment would happen. But
Mhm.
right now, enterprises normally don't support a project. They just use that.
Mhm.
And of course, then you don't get anything, any financial return on that. And uh, in every business, at some point, this becomes a
Right.
challenge. And I think like if a company is using like 10, 15, 20 open source projects, if every one of them introduces quite an expensive licensing for enterprise, then you end up suddenly needing to pay loads of money
Mhm.
from zero to like loads. And if not, you would pay in amount of time and effort from your engineers to refactor the whole thing to use something else
Right.
that maybe is open source, that maybe is done by an individual, a private person, as an alternative that also does not have any predictability in terms of how secure and how trustworthy it can be in the long run. So I'm wondering in my head, like, if a better model for the whole open source space would have been to actually have some way of kind of requiring a small financial amount to support every single project,
Right.
open source project to integrate, rather than introducing suddenly a license change with significant price increase just because
Mhm.
you are an enterprise adopter.
100%. Yeah. No, and I totally agree with you. I mean, even if we do that, let's do some quick math, right? I'm awful at math, but how many organizations would you say use Terraform?
Oh, I mean, I would say thousands. I wouldn't be
Yeah.
surprised.
So let's say we said 100,000. Do you think that that's a
Mm,
reasonable number, give or take? So
yeah.
let's say we said 100,000 and I multiplied that by, say, every organization, right? Those 100,000 organizations paid $20 a month,
Mm,
less than a Netflix subscription. What are we at? My math is terrible. 200,
mm,
no, 2 million, something
yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
200, 2 million, right?
2 million.
I think that's feasible for an
Yeah.
open source project to continue, right?
And
Um,
$20 for an enterprise. I mean, come
yeah,
on,
yeah. I
per
mean, even
month.
yeah. So let's say we did that 50,000, right?
Mm,
Let's say we and that's pretty healthy, right? Times 20. Still looking at 1,000,000.
yeah.
So, I mean, that's pretty good to keep an open source project going, right?
And that's totally different paying, $20 a month or $100 or $1,000,
Right.
versus paying $20,000 a month.
Right,
Or
exactly.
depending per team, even
Yeah,
like some of these crazy licenses
right,
out there. Like, it's much harder to convince an enterprise to pay that much versus
right.
something else, right?
100%. Yeah, and of course, look, that 1,000,000, that 2,000,000, that's that's not even paying a quarter of the people's salaries, right? So that's not a lot of money.
Mm,
But the point is, the reason why I wanted to go through that is because just that small amount can be drastically beneficial for an organization in general of an open source project. So imagine, let's say you're an open source project and you had 5,000 people using your tool multiplied by 20, that's 100,000.
mm,
That's enough to at least keep the infrastructure going, right? Or at least be able to pay the business pieces. Because even though you're an open source project, guess what? You're still paying LLC fees. You're still probably paying lawyers. Um,
mm.
you're paying for infrastructure. You're paying for testing environments, right? These are things that a lot of people aren't thinking about. So just that small amount would help drastically. You know.
Mm,
Um,
totally.
yeah. Yeah, so it's I think that there needs to be some type of shift in terms of like how we're thinking about open source. Um, everybody's got to begin to understand like this is regardless of if it's an open source project or not. This is a company. Companies to keep going, they need to make money. To make money, they have to charge in some way, whether it's a monthly subscription, whether it's paid support, whether it's just a paid tool and you have a free version, right? There has to be
Mm,
something. Um, I think if there are
yeah.
any vendors listening, the one thing to keep in mind, if let's say you're a vendor listening, and you want to do things like paid webinars, paid sponsorships, yada yada, the one thing that will help you a ton is making, though, even though you might say that it's sponsored, making those sponsored talks technical, right? Because unfortunately, a lot of the time, the reason why a lot of the people walk out of those sponsored talks is because it's somebody talking that's never written a line of code in their life, right? And that's fine, but you got to understand who your audience is. Your audience is engineers, and you need to be able to talk to them in a technical way, even if it is sponsored, right? Because this is the other thing too with vendors. You're going to have two audiences, right? You're going to have the leadership team, the CIOs, the CTOs, right? CISOs, and then you're going to have the engineering audience. Now, the engineering audience is going to be drastically important, right? Because they're the ones that are going to introduce the tools. So you need to have conversations for them, right? You need to have one lane here, but then you need to also have the conversations for the CIOs, CISOs, CTOs, right? So maybe the lane for the leadership are the research reports, right, from the various research forums, and maybe the sponsored stuff where you have a marketer up there talking, or somebody that's maybe the CIO of the vendor or the CTO of the vendor or whatever, right? But then here on the engineering track, yeah, you can have sponsored stuff and this and stuff, but you got to target it for them, right? It can't be the same pitch deck, right? It can't be the same pitch for each audience. And that's a big thing that I see as well. So I think if vendors just change their mindset a little bit to have both of these audiences that they're talking to, things will be a lot better for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, because if you as a vendor think that the classic tactics for marketing a product would work on engineers, then you are wrong. That's
Right.
what I would be as blunt and say that you are actually wrong thinking that, because I haven't seen, or I haven't talked to an engineer yet who was super interested or wasn't irritated by the marketing techniques to get a software sold to them.
100%.
We had sponsored episodes even with you, Michael, at some point earlier in a different podcast, and uh, there we got a technical episodes focusing like on going through architecture challenges of
Mhm.
making this software or a product work. And then that still, even though it was a sponsored podcast, we heard from engineers that that was super interesting,
Mhm.
because engineers are still interested in how an enterprise level product, or a product that is being adopted at scale, how is it architected in the background? What have been errors? What have been learnings? What is cool, like from the technical implementation? Even though it's sponsored, it's still interesting. And that can
Mhm.
spark interest from the engineers, who would then may come to the leadership and say, hey, we need to take a look at this product, because I believe based on its technical details, it would help us solve this and this and this, right?
Mhm.
So you can actually get those leadership leads by finding that technically focused path to the engineers, because then you don't need to make the effort of reaching their leadership. Those engineers would be interested themselves and go and get those leads to reach out to you even, right?
Right. Yeah. No, 100%. And that's, yeah, you bring up a really good point, and that was actually something that I didn't even think about. And you're 100% right. Like, we did have sponsored episodes where we said they were sponsored, and people still enjoyed them. Why? Because we broke
Mm.
down the engineering piece. We didn't have the marketer on talking about
Mm.
the business side of things, right? Like, we had somebody on that could talk about the engineering side, and even though it was sponsored, even though it was paid, people knew it. They still enjoyed it. Why? Because, again, to your point, we stuck to understanding our audience. Um,
Mm.
and this is the other thing too. Like, for example, like I just bought Gary V's new book, Gary Vaynerchuk. He's like a big guy in the marketing and all that stuff space. multimillionaire, all this stuff. And I'm going through his book because I'm always curious, right? Like for me, for example, how can I get my messaging out more for my content and stuff that I create and all that. So I look at all these different types of books. The thing that's drastically different, right, for tech vendors, whether you're open source, paid, whatever, the same rules will apply. How you market in the tech realm is different than any other market. Give you an example. If you're looking at, like, for example, I just, from the TikTok shop yesterday, I just bought the push-up thing, right? Where it's this push-up pad, but it shows you, like, it's all color coded, and like one color is for triceps, another color is for shoulders, other color is
Oh.
for chest. Why did I buy it? I saw a bunch of ads on TikTok about it. Those ads didn't deter me from buying it. I was like, oh, this is actually really interesting, right? Let me buy it. It was like $12. Screw it. I saw these shoes. I think they were discounted for like $25. I thought they looked cool. No idea if they're going to be comfortable or not. For that price, they might not be the best. Maybe they'll end up being gym shoes. But I was like, whatever, Try to run an ad against an engineer. Not only are they going to freak out, but they're going to hate your product immediately. For every other space, for every other B2C is business to consumer, right? So if I'm going directly to somebody that is going to buy my product, not a company that's going to buy my product. Shoes, makeup, clothes, real estate, whatever works in that fashion. Ads, general marketing, all that stuff. In tech, it does not. So as a vendor, again, whether you're open source, whoever, or whatever, you got to really know how to get your market, Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
So before we
Yeah,
wrap
that
up today,
sounds like a
anything?
roundup.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah, I was just gonna ask you before. Yeah, but you already said it. You knew I was about to say it. I turned the face on when I'm about to ask.
Oh, sorry about that. No, that sounded like a good roundup from the future of open source to how you should market a technical product. But I think that is an interesting discussion and an interesting food for thoughts, hopefully for our listeners as well. And maybe to round up, I'm wondering like how can we round this up? So to round this up, I got a brain freeze. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Um, I'm wondering if we could round up like by asking or recommending an organization that would consider adopting a new open source project. Maybe this is something you could think about. Like if you would like to adopt a new open source project in your organization, what can we recommend? I guess one thing we can recommend is to consider supporting it, because I
Mm,
think that is probably something that any open source project would gain a lot of help from.
mm,
Consider contributing to that open source project, not necessarily by writing a lot of code for that project or developing a new feature for it, but even help with creating issues or creating suggestions or suggesting some kind of changes would also help. Um, is there anything else that you can come up with to recommend such organizations?
yeah, I would say understand the value that it provides for your
Mm,
organization. So, and this is, I think, something that we've all made this mistake. I know in the beginning of my career, I made this mistake countless times. I still make this mistake. I look at a project and I say, wow, that's really cool. This is awesome. I want to implement it. But what I have to do is I have to take a step back and say, what value does this bring to what I'm trying to accomplish here at my job. Even when I'm consulting for organizations, it's like, okay, I'm thinking about implementing this, but like, why? What value is this going to provide for the organization? And I would say that that's the biggest part of it, is because there are a lot of tools and stuff, and there are a lot of vendors, and the only way to truly differentiate is to understand what value it brings to your organization.
Mm, great. And maybe the one more point that I came up with is be prepared, or like consider an option that at some point this open source project may not
Mm,
be active anymore, and or may be archived. So
mm,
think about that when you are adopting that project. What would you do if this happens? Of course, if you are integrating a project, for example, that is governed by an organization like CNCF and the Linux Foundation, it will probably take more factors for it to like disappear or be archived. But this will not be the case if it's outside of such governance organizations. So think about how tightly it will be integrated into your organization and what the consequences would be in case of it being archived, and what would be the alternatives in case that happens. So just don't assume that it will be there
mm.
and be actively developed for many, many years ahead. Just always consider the way out in case such a situation happens.
Yeah, makes sense. Totally agree. All right. Good. Great places
Cool.
to end off there. So thank you, everybody, for
Yeah.
listening. Really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
And we will see you next time.
See you.